morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to South Africa, the land where apartheid ended 25 years ago, so we have nothing left to be angry about. 50 years of oppression will have no effect on the mind, no effect on the future generation. I mean, why else would they abuse my people and tell them to get over it? I mean, it happened so long ago. You are only 19, and why are you so angry? You weren't there. But they forget who raised me, who raised the woman who raised me, who raised them. Just because you are born after 1994 does not mean that you are born free, especially if your mind is enslaved. The formerly oppressed are the ones who are expected to raise the future of this country. But no matter how much the future grows, it is still watered down by the past. If you are made from the seed of truth, how can you not be angry? Yes, it did happen so long ago, but the effects are still present to date. Just because the name of our oppression has changed does not mean that oppression no longer exists. It is just more subtle. It has learned how to hide itself better. It has learned how to put makeup on its bruises, how to paint on a smile, how to apologize for being female, for not knowing its place, for being black, for being white, for being colored, for being Indian, for being Asian, for being Muslim, for being Christian, for being Hindu, for being gay, for being queer, for being trans, for being everything that they cannot understand, for being everything they choose not to understand. If you do not fit into this box, they will squish you until you do. They will compress you and compress you and compress you until you fit into this box called oppression. Liberal psychology sees through the box and understands that the box is all in our minds. It tries to understand how we got there, and better yet, how to get out of there and to stay out of there. It removes the chains around our thoughts, shackle by shackle, shackle by shackle, until the word shackle is no longer the chain that is holding us down. It reminds us that we could be free if we weren't slaves to the chains of each other. Yeah, we could be free, truly. If I see my enemy as my brother, we could be free, but only through the study. Thank you.
Thank you. Please again thank Masana Maluleke, who is a first-year student at UWC. And like all of the best people, she comes from the north, from Pretoria and Johannesburg. Masana is a spoken word artist, student at UWC, and has been writing poetry, and that's just her own work that she created for us. She speaks about her work as a subtle reflection of truths we thought would remain hidden. She's won various poetry prizes, and it's unsurprising why she has. And writing poetry since 2014. She's passionate about English, language and art and writing, and she says she does this to be heard. She's studying currently BCom accounting. So if anyone can give us some career advice, this is the time to do it. All right, please join me again in thanking Masana Maluleke. If the voices that need to be heard are the voices of the future, then you can see that's where they are. I also want to welcome you to this seminar, this talk by Chris and Urmi, who we're very lucky to have here. They are being brought out by our co-hosts, the Institute for Social and Health Sciences from UNISA and from the International Hospital at UWC. as well as and is supported by the South African Medical Research Council, and the unit is the Violence, Injury and Peace Promotion Research Unit. Am I right? Okay, Violence, Injury and Peace Research Unit. That's fine. The focus is really a distinct pleasure for me to welcome you to UWC. The space here has been a space that, over the many years, worked quite hard to foreground the contextual nature of psychology, how we're shaped by some of the processes that happen in our society, and whether they be from the early 80s, the period of struggle at UWC. UWC has often been called the intellectual home of the left, and it's a space where, following the negotiations in 1990, the release of Nelson Mandela, a lot of the exiles, academics came back to the university, and also locals here came back to the university to be able to create a space where we could contribute to the country that we were bequeathing to Masana and others like her at the university. That job is not finished. There's still a lot to do. And so it's really nice to be able to have a kind of focus here that brings together academics, psychology staff, students, to talk about how some ideas of a perspective of the oppressed, how that perspective needs to be heard very strongly, because that's what brings about the change in the world. With the move now much more to fascism and globally the move to the right, with the orange head, as well as Boris Johnson, who's a mop head himself. It's really important for voices that are not always heard, the voices from the South, to be able to bring a clarity to what needs to be addressed in the world. Poverty, malnutrition, refugee work, and climate change. So it's really wonderful that you guys are here today. So I'm going to ask and hand over to Shanaz to take over from here. I also want to thank Saisa. Saisa's driving this quite a lot. If you haven't signed up for Saisa, please return the food that you ate. But Saisa is the Psychology Association, and it will be, they have a very active student division, and I want to recognize Genevieve Barrows, who is the poster child for how things need to be done by all the other divisions. So Genevieve, just thank you for that. I'll hand over to Shanaz.
Hello everyone. It's interesting to see what live streaming does. I was listening to Umesh and I was thinking, I know why he's saying that. So, during the last few weeks, we've exchanged several messages about plans finally coming together, and you being able to travel to Cape Town for several engagements, including this lecture. It's fantastic that it's worked out. A warm welcome to the two of you once again. Really lovely to have you here, and of course a warm welcome to the audience. But I want to add that our guest visit to Cape Town is about far more than good planning and your diaries and our diaries coming together. Actually, it has a lot to do with solidarities, with friendship, with kinship, with roots as in roots, and roots as in roots. It has also much to do with our mutual epistemological and political objections to the psychologies in which we have been schooled, which, as we know, tend to be classist and racist and sexist, and these foundations and formations of these psychologies continue to produce the kinds of ahistorical, acontextual, and really quite pathologizing ways of thinking about the world and thinking about individuals and their social systems that we have been problematizing for a while. It also has much to do with our collective discontent about how these psychologies tend to breed discourses of othering and essentially erase and silence the experiences of injustice, oppression, and inequality that we know typify the lives of most people across the world. And so we have also become connected through our respective efforts and our engagements in both the perils and possibilities of psychology. And we certainly have been talking a great deal about the perils. With the recent insurgent turn in the discipline, particularly in the Global South, I believe, we are seeing really exciting initiatives across contexts to this end. Initiatives that have, in different ways, engaged with issues of, well, that have got to do with critique and knowledge production, that have got to do with radical praxis and boundary crossing and boundary rupturing, that's got to do with horizontal engagement with students, that's got to do with transformative and transgressive pedagogies, that's got to do with politicization and activism. So it's really an exciting time in many ways. In South Africa, in the main, this has been animated in the main, perhaps not altogether, through transdisciplinary contributions on decolonizing feminist and African psychologies. And the spaces created by my colleagues and comrades in the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences, as well as, and I have to mention them in their absence, as well as the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies, which is located at the University of Cape Town, are two examples. There are many more examples, I'm sure, but certainly in Cape Town, these are two very good examples of this exciting work that's being done and the kind of energy and work that feels very vibrant and very exciting at the moment, very dynamic. On the other hand, my colleagues in the Institute for Social and Health Sciences say, let's do this, but, and here allow me, friends, colleagues, to quote you, say, if embracing the way that psychology bends and contorts under the emancipatory requirements of feminism, decoloniality, and African-centeredness gives rise to something that looks very little like psychology as we know it, then so be it. So that said, Professors Son and Dutta, we are most interested to hear your thoughts on the possibilities and limits of liberation psychology. We're also really interested to hear about the work that you have been doing in your respective contexts that relate to understanding social suffering and resistance and solidarity in contexts such as ours and yours. A little bit about the lecture itself then. The lecture will, in broad terms, focus on liberation psychology-oriented scholarship produced in different contexts that inform efforts to produce responsive, reflexive, and transformative psychologies. Our colleagues will consider the potential of liberation psychology for understanding, documenting, and interrogating forms of suffering that tend to be excluded from dominant discourse, especially where in contexts where civil society is weakened. Of course, I understand you're going to be talking about your work as well. So now's a good time to actually say a little bit about you. Professor Dutta is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts Lowell in the USA. I think it is just past 7 a.m. your time, is it? Yeah, more or less. Professor Dutta is currently a scholar in residence at the National Center for Institutional Diversity and Department of Women's Studies at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. You're doing really, really interesting work. I know that you see yourself very much as a scholar and an activist, and that your research focuses on everyday violence and is very directly focused on oppressive conditions and ways of articulating experiences of oppression and silence. Professor Son is operating at past 11 p.m. time. Is that correct? Sorry. He's an associate professor in community psychology at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, importantly on the land of the Wurundjeri, have I pronounced it correctly, of the Kulin Nation. His research examines histories of colonialism and oppression and its continuities in various forms of structural violence and its effects on social identities, intergroup relations, and belonging. There's a lot more to be said about the two of you, but we won't take away more of your time. This I want to say for the live streaming, if you have questions, can you please email your questions to email address iro@uwc.ac.za. I believe it is noted on the link itself. And then finally, before I hand over to you, I just want to share this with the audience. Obviously, we know you've traveled long hours, that you're very jet lagged, and I want to share that they overindulged in dessert last night. And I've been given to understand that this makes for quite a heady, interesting and unpredictable cocktail. So we, the hosts, can't guarantee what's to come, which makes it all the more interesting. Welcome.
Thank you, Shahnaz and Umesh, for hosting us and for the very generous introduction. So Chris and I will both be talking about the possibilities and limits of liberation psychology today in our own contexts. Close to 2 million people, Bengali and Bengal origin Muslim communities, were recently disenfranchised in the northeastern state of Assam, people who now risk detention and statelessness. This was done by updating the National Register of Citizens, or NRC, a list established in 1951 to surveil so-called foreigners or Bengal origin communities. The state is in the process of constructing detention camps where many of those who have been disenfranchised will be held. The news outlet Democracy Now! Described it as the largest disenfranchisement in human history. Yet numbers are not always persuasive, especially when it pertains to the suffering of people in the global south. As the scholar Edward Said had argued, quote, "Facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them," end quote. I read liberation psychology as a form of scholar activism, one that prioritizes collective action from below. It calls for an engagement with the concrete historical and political consequences of our work. Why do we do what we do? By whom is the work done? Who does it benefit? Like many other anti-oppressive theories, liberation psychology advocated for re-embedding methods within actual historical and social contexts, a decided challenge to establishment psychology's preoccupation with method, especially quantitative methods. So rather than a focus on the intrinsic value of particular methods, the focus or the emphasis is on leveraging methodologies to transform lived conditions of injustice and the structures that underlie them. Research then is reconceptualized as an elementary capacity through which ordinary citizens can contribute to and expand knowledge about their oppressive and unjust conditions with the objective of transforming it. Today I will talk about the potential of liberation psychology for interrogating forms of social suffering that are excluded from dominant discourse. Liberation psychology was born out of people's struggles, so any meaningful engagement with liberatory praxis must be anchored in concrete projects of social justice. As such, I will ground my analysis and reflections in my activist scholarship in Northeast India, where I was born and raised. At the borders of the nation state, both physical and in the popular imaginary, Northeast India, the people, the struggles are viewed through the lens of national security. The region has come to acquire labels such as remote, dangerous, and disturbed. Such callous reference have very different ramifications for those of us who call these locales home. My decision to study psychology was driven by the desire to tell our stories, to participate in knowledge production as opposed to being a passive entity that is objectified in public and scholarly representations. I was drawn to approaches that were mobilized as responses to oppressive conditions in the majority world, including but not limited to liberation psychology, decolonial theory, critical indigenous studies, third world feminisms, and so on. In the remaining talk, I'm going to take up a couple of issues of liberatory psychology praxis as they are grounded in my work in Northeast India. Denaturalizing the normal and centering relational ethics. I will wrap up with brief reflections on the limit and possibilities of liberation psychology. And I do so with an acknowledgement that there is no theoretical purity. When we center communities in resistance and struggle, we have to move away from theoretical orthodoxy and bring different ideas, their convergences and contradictions into dialogue. And to do that with a willingness and a commitment to contend with the discomfort and potential incommensurability. A critical contribution of liberation psychology has been a focus on everyday as an analytical category. It involves attending to structural injustice as it is produced, materialized, epidermalized, and as it penetrates the recesses of everyday life, what Ignacio Martin Barrow called normal abnormality. The imperative to denaturalize the normal could not be more relevant today in the face of the current citizenship exercise in Assam, Northeast India, where the National Register of Citizens disenfranchised 2 million people. Liberation starts with problematization or a critical interrogation of things as they are. So it is vital to avoid reinscribing the violence inherent in dominant or hegemonic conceptualizations, something that we heard in the poem right before these talks. And this is also something that Chicana feminist Emma Perez argues, quote, when conceptualized in certain ways, the naming of things already leaves something out, leaves something unsaid, leaves silences and gaps that must be uncovered. Therefore, I begin by uncovering some of the silences that underlie who or what gets framed as a problem in the context of Assam. The problem there is framed as that of quote-unquote illegal immigrants. I call it the specter because of the way in which narratives of illegal immigrants, foreigners, and infiltrators have haunted the cultural and geopolitics of Assam during the entire post-colonial period. These categories are often pitted against those of original inhabitants, genuine Indian citizens, or indigenous people. Dominant cultural discourses, as well as officially designated categories, work in tandem to construct so-called immigrants as inherently illegitimate and suspicious, as the outsider who constitutes a generalized threat to so-called genuine citizens. The category of illegal immigrants is not a homogeneous one. Interrogating the category, I found that it includes ethnic Bengalis, both Hindus and Muslims, indigenous and migrant Muslim communities, internally displaced people, and migrant workers, including Adivasis or indigenous people from other parts of the country who were transplanted by the British to work in the tea estates in the region. Essentially, the category of illegal immigrant has come to stand for a diverse group of ethnic, linguistic, and religious others. It is used to dehumanize the other, to deny the persecution against them, and ultimately to delegitimize any claims for justice. Problematization also involves a shift in gaze from or on oppressed groups to the political, economic, and social structural processes that sustain their oppression. In this case, it meant examining the coloniality of borders, cartographies, and policies implicated in the citizenship crisis. The National Register of Citizens, or the NRC policy, is itself a colonial derivative with its roots in an imperial act, the Foreigners Act of 1946, which legitimized the vocabulary of detecting, deleting, and deporting so-called foreigners. It's important to remember that borders are not natural, but are constructed as a result of complex negotiations between states and is often incongruent with people's geopolitical and lived realities. Imperial and colonial geographers in particular use borders to assert control over subject populations. In British-occupied India, borders were systematically deployed to regulate borders and belonging, something that's illustrated in the image here, in Assam and sort of the borders between Assam and Bengal. These shifting cartographies were fraught with violence, most pronounced in the genocidal violence during nation-making in South Asia, whether it was India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. The border then is a site of violence, both epistemological and material, in mutually constitutive and reinforcing relationship. The infographic that I have here is taken from the official NRC website, the government website. It lays out the processes that people whose names are excluded from the list have to go through in order to submit their claims. And I know it's really small and hard to see, but my purpose here was not to go through the process, but to really show how convoluted and complicated the process of making citizenship claims is. And what's happening here is that bureaucratic documentation has become the sole and overriding criterion for establishing citizenship and any kind of claims to belonging, something that anthropologist Arjuna Padwai calls statizenship, where all rights and identity claims are linked to state-issued documents. When we consider this being enforced in the context of histories of violence and forced displacement, complicated borders, high levels of poverty, low levels of functional literacy, and where meticulous record keeping has never been the norm, we begin to see how the NRC operates as a form of state-sanctioned violence. In fact, legality or illegality cannot be a framework in these contexts where the law has been mobilized as an instrument of control and expulsion. There is a willful forgetting, a determined unwillingness to grasp or even name the historical contingencies of colonialism, violence of nation-making, and internal displacement that have shaped demographic patterns in Northeast India, especially Assam. It is what Martin Barrow calls a social lie, and Hussein Bulhan called metacolonialism, the distortion of reality and memory to restrain collective consciousness and maintain an oppressive status quo. The power to name what is silenced is an important one and an ethical imperative in liberation psychology praxis. For many Bengal-origin Muslim communities in Assam, citizenship has become an existential question, a question of being or not being. There have been close to 80 deaths related to the NRC. Many of these were suicides stemming from fear, despair, and the indignities of being rendered stateless. A vast majority of those disenfranchised live with the perennial threat of flood-induced displacement as they occupy some of the most ecologically fragile regions, the riverine islands that are flooded every monsoon. Yet neither the scope nor depth of suffering seem to register in any real way in wider civil society in Assam. Repressive conditions not only inflict collective trauma, but also undermine civil society. Gross violations and atrocities are accepted as permissible events when inflicted against certain members of society, such as the persecution of Muslims in India. Diane Bell's notion of the downpresser, or elite middle-class bystanders to state terror, is particularly relevant in this context. The lack of critical consciousness in the downpresser, Bell argues, results in a kind of seeing that overlooks or fails to witness trauma. Under repressive conditions, this becomes an absent present that we have to train ourselves to see and to name. It is essential to turn our gaze onto the indifference and pernicious silence that maintain injustice and preclude signification of collective suffering or harm. Pretending indifference and inaction in the public sphere is therefore fundamental to any psychosocial transformation. I'll talk a little bit about centering relational ethics now. Feminist liberation psychologists, especially those influenced by third world feminisms, have been particularly attuned to the ever-present risk of reproducing rescue narratives or appropriating struggles of marginalized communities. As important as it is to interrogate oppressive structures, we need to do so in ways that center relational ethics. Relational ethics are predicated on ontological assumptions that prioritize the interconnectedness and interdependence of human lives, not to be confused with the strategic or instrumental view of relationships as part of gaining entry into communities in order to do research, to produce more accurate analysis. A radical alternative that disrupts transactional research relationship is that of psychosocial accompaniment. With its roots in liberation theology, psychosocial accompaniment centers relational understandings that include structural analysis of oppression, as well as the embodied and affective significance of suffering. The one who accompanies is also a witness. This witnessing is imperative under conditions where social exclusion and suffering are repressed or unrecognized by the wider society, as is the case with the mass-scale disenfranchisement in Assam. Yet the slippage into courtroom metaphors of witness and testimony is fraught with difficulties. It is important to note that the kind of witnessing that we're talking about here is not expert witnessing focused on objective details, but a form of responsible witnessing that James Hadley describes as the wounding of the other as registered in the first place not as an objective fact but as a subjective blow, a persecution, a trauma. The witness refuses to forget the weight of this blow or the depth of the wound it inflicts. Witnessing then is not simply a form of knowing the world, but also being and acting in it, and more importantly, wrestling with it beyond the limits of our academic profession. Over conversations, travel, and shared meals with grassroots organizers in Assam, I learned about the precarious existence of Bengal origin Muslim communities, the criminalization of dissent and resistance, and the pain-filled stories they hear and hold as part of their work. Participating in a gender justice camp that occurred while I was there, I listened to the ways in which documentation is weaponized by the state in a patrilocal and patrilineal context to disenfranchise women. At the same time, I witnessed the ways in which women are mobilizing other women in their communities to understand structural barriers, supporting them to document their stories, and building evidence for policy advocacy. Striving to establish radically different parameters of engagement and accountability, we, the grassroots organizers and I, are currently building a community action research collective as a way to document both social suffering and community resistance. We don't know quite yet what that's going to look like, but we do know that building an assemblage that honors people's stories and bring those into the public arena to be acknowledged and witnessed is going to be an integral part of our work. So a few concluding thoughts on limits and possibilities of liberation psychology. Liberation psychology in Latin America is historically rooted in resistance to class-based oppression, often referred to as the preferential option for the poor. It is explicitly aligned with the oppressed rather than the oppressor. We interpret this broadly to center the histories, lived experiences, and struggles of people who have been marginalized and dispossessed. Yet the theories we mobilize require ongoing scrutiny for their inherent legacies and effects. It is then paramount that we trace the contours of mutually constituting vectors of oppressions. So it becomes really critical to not simply think of oppression as a monolithic category, but to understand what are the mutually constitutive categories that are implicated in that oppression. Furthermore, the oppressor and the oppressed do not always constitute a binary, nor are they homogeneous entities. Gloria Anzaldúa writes about this in her conceptualization of a mestiza consciousness that rejects simple dualisms such as insider-outsider, colonizer-colonized, instead arguing for a mutual implication whereby the oppressor and the oppressed, as she describes it, leak into each other's lives. Crucially, this mutual implication is based not on sameness, but on a salience of oppressive histories. It troubles notions of solidarity that have the potential to reinscribe settler colonial logic and absolve those who benefit from coloniality. This again goes back to the point that I had raised at the beginning of my talk about incommensurability, that there has to be a way in which we can act in solidarity even with an ethic of incommensurability. So we do not have to equate different struggles for social justice in order to be able to stand in solidarity. The potential of liberation psychology is in its framing as a call for action, a critical consideration of the impact of our praxis in the places and spaces we work. Thus, embedded in liberatory praxis is a politics and psychology of possibility, a radical imaginary and creative engagement with what ought or needs to be done. Towards that end, we have to transcend our disciplinary allegiances to be class waiters or negative workers who disrupt expected academic or disciplinary roles and statuses, even when it is detrimental to our professional success. Stated another way, our liberation psychology praxis must always be tethered to concrete struggles for justice and should always be in service of communities in resistance and struggle. In that spirit, and on that note, I will end with a poem penned by Ashraful Hussain, a grassroots activist in Assam. He recently shared this poem at a People's Tribunal that was held in New Delhi as part of his testimony, both as a grassroots organizer as well as his own experiences of disenfranchisement. Entitled Quit India 83 Bajpayee, the poem draws attention to continuities of violence and repression against Bengal origin Muslim communities, from a 1983 massacre that killed and displaced thousands of people to the present disenfranchisement exercise. This is a genre of resistance poetry called Mia poetry, and the poets who have been writing and translating Mia poetry they've been persecuted significantly by the state. The poem that I'm going to read today was translated into English by Shalim Hussain, who is a Mia poet himself and both writes and translates poetry. Quit India 83 Bajpayee. I stood in the courtroom and watched you. I thought you would be able to give me justice. I closed my eyes and started telling you about my Janam Kundali, my childhood, my youth, old age, riot, Quit India, 1983, Bajpayee, everything. You turn out my worn out, moth-eaten documents. Your stamp goes thump, thump, thump. Your pen draws a long line. The sounds fall on my ears and my eyes are shut. My heart shivers. I open my eyes and my hands are in the hands of salaried gunslingers, and I'm taken to my cell. My days pass in fear and uncertainty, like a common criminal, lost to dignity, lost to justice. Evidence is my dressing style and language, and punishment is no nationality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, appreciate that. We're going to have Chris come through, and then we'll have some time for the discussions and for us to talk to each other.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of ad-libbing, which is the way that I operate normally, but I'll try and stay on time. See that Kevin Son has turned up. He's obviously left the kids at school, the whiff. Thanks for the opportunity to present alongside Ermi on the topic of the limits and possibilities of liberation psychologies. We've had, as Shanaz has pointed out, have had lots of conversations and have got a broad network of people who are working in solidarity, constructing alternative ways of thinking about and engaging with and through psychology for ourselves and for the people that we love and for the people who we work with. I'm very grateful to my friends and colleagues here who've invited me and I can be part of their empowering decolonial community. It's very important to me, someone who lives over in Australia. I was a student here in 1985, so it's been a long time since coming here, and it's really significant and important for me to be able to come here after having left in first year when I was enrolled in a BA Harvard year. I was going to become a teacher, as is the Son tradition, I think. I also want to acknowledge all of the people who come before me, whose stories have been silenced, erased, excluded from the archives of South Africa's history. I'm grateful to my grandfather, who left an inscription in a book on South Africa's history that he gifted me when I was 16, in which he highlighted the denial, erasure of black and colored people, and I quote, contribution to the history of the land of our birth. I acknowledge my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, their struggles, their resilience, their survivance. I'm thankful that they've welcomed me and included me in the spaces that they continue to create to heal, recover, decolonize. I work at Victoria University on the land of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. It's on this land with many groups that I, a member of the African diaspora, a black settler, is learning, deconstructing, co-constructing decolonial practices in the context of liberation and community psychologies. But I'm not alone in this, of course. Constructed a group called Community Identity Displacement Research Network. So it would be a mistake for me to say that I'm doing all of this by myself. We always work with people. I want to draw on some of the work that we've been doing as part of that group in the different disciplines, in community psychology, and through the various collaborative transdisciplinary projects that we engage in as we construct community psych. By community engaged, I mean research that is responsive to the needs and issues of community, groups, organizations, especially groups who are subjected to structural, symbolic violence and who suffer its consequences. The work that I draw on has largely been produced in response to coloniality, racism, sexism, and the intersections with other dimensions of oppression in the Australian context. My recent focus, however, is on coloniality and the racialization of Indigenous Australians and various ethnicized settler diasporas, in particular members of the African diaspora. The questions that I ask is how can we engage in ways that support rather than undermine and do harm to the communities that have endured the horrible systems of domination, colonialism? What are the various ways in which these are expressed, understandings of self, other, and intergroup relations? So the next section is a little bit of an overview of how we've come to and how we engage with liberation psychology. My colleague who I did some work with, Maritza Montero, has been quite influential and talks about liberation approaches as part of a broader paradigm of work that is differently expressed, and we find it in Paulo Freire's work in education, in liberation philosophy with Enrique Dussel, in sociology, and a whole number of other sorts of areas that have been developed in the global south. Martin Barrault was critical of psychology, as Ermi has noted before, advocated for a new approach with a focus on the needs of people, privileging the voices of people, and constructing psychology from the vantage points of the oppressed. There were, of course, expressions of liberation-oriented psychology in other countries, and not only Latin America, that were characterized by conditions of oppression and resistance. These include, of course, liberation psychologies called for by Mohammad Sadat, based on the work of Steve Biko, and other critical writing, including the writing of Enriquez in the Philippines and so forth. So there's a whole lot of other areas of work that is to be discovered, and I think that's very much part of the decolonial project that Shanaz and others are leading here in South Africa. Many have engaged with and continue to engage with the ideas that have been generated in liberation approaches, in particular those that have been advanced by Martin Barreau. Some of these include, as Ermi has outlined already, a commitment to praxis, Freire's consciousness raising, concepts such as de-idealization, which is the problematizing, taking for granted realities, the recovery of historical memory, and the importance of dialogue and relational ethics, and participatory approaches that engage people in the process of self-transformation and transformation of oppressive realities. See, I can't multitask. Okay, so my efforts and our work sits in the Australian context, where we have been working in the context of Australia's history of race relations. The relations are inherently racialized and premised on the dispossession of First Nations people and the ongoing dynamics of coloniality. Aileen Morton Robinson, an Indigenous feminist scholar, argued that Australia was founded as a settler colonial nation on the theft of land, the dehumanization of racialized other, and simultaneous construction of the myth of a national white identity that has become ingrained and reproduced institutionally and culturally. She writes that belonging to the new nation was racialized and inextricably tied to the accumulation of capital and the social worth, authority, and ownership that this conferred. The Indigenous were excluded from the condition of belonging. The white body was the norm and measure for identifying who belonged. So racism is but one aspect of the matrix of power, which has been described by various critical scholars. Grossfogel offers this summation. Racism is a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority that have been politically, culturally, and economically produced and reproduced for centuries by institutions of the capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. A lot of hyphens. So part of what I've been doing is trying to locate and figure out how we construct a psychology instead of borrow one from the US as we typically do in the Australian context that is responsive to how we experience the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a number of strands of what we've incorporated into our work. So my work started with examining migration, displacement, and acculturation, partly based on my own experiences. And this has opened up a window into acculturation psychology and the various ways in which questions about migrant displacement experiences were framed through assimilationist lens and a deficit orientation. In addition to this, there were very little writing in the Australian psychology journals on the experiences of South African migrants or any other migrant for that matter, let alone people of color and black communities. Lesson one for me, Australian psychology has a Eurocentric core and is complicit in producing psychologies that normalizes worlds of those above the line of the human. Grossfogel draws on Fanon's idea of the line of the human, which divides those people above the line as recognized socially in their humanity as human beings and thus enjoying access to rights, human rights, civil rights, women's rights, and or labor rights, material resources, and social recognition to their subjectivities, identities, epistemologies, and spiritualities. Those below the line are seen as non-human, thus undeserving of the same rights, resources, and recognition. The writing of scholars advancing black psychology, Steve Biko's Black Consciousness, Hussein Boulan's work, and a number of others offered a counterpoint to this Eurocentrism that was part of the hegemony, that is part of the hegemony still of mainstream Western Euro-American psychology. The Eurocentric underpinnings were further highlighted when I began to spend more time with Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. I quickly learned about the omissions and complicity of academia and psychology in the colonial project in that country. These were difficult lessons for me in many ways. It meant that I had a limited toolkit, along with the fact that I was also a racialized other in dominant institutions where I have responsibility for diversifying psychology's curriculum. It became my task. I began the slow process of deconstructing and unlearning with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues about their history, about ways of knowing, doing, being, suffering, oppression, struggle, and their survival. The writing of Maori scholar Linda Smith on decolonizing methodologies provided a useful resource, a significant resource, a way to make sense of what I was learning with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about their resistance and anti-colonial work. They were creating spaces for cultural strengthening, for healing and responding to the genocidal practices that saw their children removed from families and placed in institutions run by missions and churches. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, academics across the country are engaging in decolonizing and anti-colonial work, expressing Aboriginal ways of knowing, doing, and being. We identified decolonial writing in Australia that assisted with our own work of constructing responsive liberation psychologies. These include Lester Rigney's Indigenous Research Framework, which privileges Indigenous voices and political integrity and is aimed at resistance, which is central to emancipation. Karen Martin, another Indigenous scholar, also outlined principles that anchored the Aboriginal people's worldviews, knowledge, and realities. The need to privilege their experiences, to honor social mores and practices on country and lands, and understanding context in shaping experiences. Central to this writing was the articulation of different ontologies, different cosmologies, and ways of being rooted in relationality and reciprocity, and connected people with the natural world. There were more questions, of course, not just migration and not just Indigenous matters. Students from white Anglo, ostensibly white Anglo students, were also interested in Indigenous empowerment, but often with little reflection on their gendered, raced subjectivities. Whiteness is unmarked, unraced, normative. Whiteness studies provided for me, and also for many Anglo students, who had limited awareness of psychology's complicity in the colonial project, who wanted to cross borders and find ways to support Aboriginal self-determination. Whiteness studies shifted the focus, the gaze, toward power and privilege. It brought tools for critical reflexive accompaniment and a lens to examine operations of power and knowledge as in and through dominant discourse, as it is expressed in and through dominant discourses, and in everyday symbolic and material practices. I don't want to draw crude boundaries around whiteness, indigeneity, and migrant identities, but understanding these as social locations has helped me clarify my own positioning in relation to the various communities I'm involved with through teaching, research, and community engagement. By crossing borders in the flesh into communities and through and across areas of inquiry, I've engaged in a form of bricolage, a sort of harvesting conceptual resources for critical reflective practices that disrupt structural and epistemic violence. This location is akin to what Ermi has described, using Gloria Anzaldua's notion of mestiza consciousness, from which to challenge, resist, and enact liberation orientation. The central question is, how do we create mobilized liberation community psychologies and outside of the university to contribute to empowerment and self-determination of the various groups who suffer the brunt of structural violence and produces social suffering. So for us, liberation psychology and community arts practice and our group have articulated a sort of a vision about what it is that we're actually interested in doing and how we assemble resources that allows us to actually get to that. Community arts and cultural practice has been a very central part of that, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that is and give you some examples of projects of that work. So over the years, our group have collaborated to document and examine community arts practice as a vehicle for responsive and sensitive way to deconstruct, recover historical memory, and to create count stories. Community arts practice is an intentional community arts practice is an intentional practice that involves partnerships between communities and artists to foster community identity and well-being. Community arts practice shares with liberation and community psychology principles of participation, inclusion, and it embraces creative methods that are key to dialogue and process of deconstruction and reconstruction. Different arts modalities are used in and to create contact zones where differently positioned people can come together for the intentional purpose of individual and collective change. When framed with the liberation psychology framework, the goal of arts projects, quote, is to reconstruct resources to transform structures of language and society, to de-ideologize understandings, and to make space for re-symbolizing and signifying the world, enlarging the possibilities for restructuring economic, social, and personal realities. Mary Watkins states that arts practice restore the capacity for meaning making through what Green refers to as aesthetic experience. Some of my students use core drama processes of distancing, witnessing, and empathy to show how arts methods can foster consciousness and transformative social experiences. The capacity of aesthetic practice as mediational tools lies in breaking with habitual and routine practices to create new ways of sensing and engaging with the social world. It has the capacity to awaken senses to injustice. So I'm going to talk about two projects now to give some examples of how we are trying to create liberation community psychology. So the first project is part of a 10-year-long partnership with community arts, and I'm only speaking about a small part of that. With the Community Arts Agency, and the second project also, one was in Western Australia and the second one is in Melbourne. So this one is called Narrating Stories on Country. It's still Noongar country. So I've worked with the Community Arts Network in Western Australia, and I've worked with them as a board member, evaluator, researcher. And one of my students joined me in 2010, and we've been partnering that organization in the work that they do in Indigenous people. So one of the most recent projects focus on counter stories. Smith has emphasized that the importance of counter stories and storytelling as part of the Liberation and Decolonial project is that stories hold alternative histories, is to hold alternative knowledges. The pedagogical implication of this access to alternative knowledge is that they can form the basis of alternative ways of doing things, telling our stories from the past, reclaiming the past, giving testimony to the injustices of the past, are all strategies which are commonly employed by Indigenous peoples struggling for justice. The Community Arts Network, who we partner, created a storytelling project in response to the Noongar people, which is the Indigenous group in the southwest of Western Australia in Perth. All of whom grew up on missions or reserves on the outskirts of towns, who wanted to tell their legacy and have a record of their experiences. With the community, staff created a program of activities that included narrative collection, intergenerational storytelling, portraiture, exhibitions, so all different ways of documenting. As researchers, we had the role of documenting, evaluating, and theorizing the overall program. And while our focus of this work was on documenting the role of the arts and improving the psychosocial well-being and race relations, we realized that through the various phases of the research, the elders themselves wanted their stories to be told. This was a pivotal moment in the research for us and signaled the major shift. While originally we were hesitant about representing the stories of the elders, we also realized the significance of creating a space through the research for the stories to be central to the work. Hence, we brought community practice into conversation with narrative inquiry in order to elevate the stories of the elders about oppression, psychosocial suffering, and the way in which they survive. So I'm just going to show you some of the sorts of stories that they've said. But what we did was conceptualize the stories of the elders as counter stories, and we adopted what Chase referred to as the supportive narrative voice, which pushes the narrator's voice into the limelight. We reported three themes of what the elders were talking about. And they're really sad sorts of stories that people were talking about, but they were also talking about survival and resistance. And the three themes that we talked about there was that they're narrating the circuits of dispossession, the different means through which they were dispossessed of land, of culture, of family, and of community. And there are two of the sorts of ways, using their words, as they talk about the experiences of dispossession and the memories of dispossession. They talk about the consequences of dispossession, that it was psychic harm, it was burned into our brains, how we were treated as animals. And they also talk about continuity and survival, and they talk about indigenous cultural belief systems, connection to country, and how this is important in their own survival sort of strategies. The stories of the elders provided testimony to the ongoing effects and the various ways people were seeking to protect themselves, resist and survive culturally and psychologically. For them, colonization was not an event. It was a systematic process that continues through coloniality. The stories that the roots of suffering are in colonial dispossession and contemporary coloniality, which exists and are performed in everyday institutions. These stories also show that through processes of remembering and reconnection and cultural renewal, which is part of Martin Barro's process of the recovery of historical memory, people are laying foundations for survival, and as researchers we are looking at the ways in which we can support those processes. The other project that I'd like to share is one that is about people of color. I don't really like the term people of color, but this is the way in which Australia is struggling with figuring out what do we do with so many black people who've migrated to this country. We have a multicultural policy, which ideally was about different European groups who settled in Australia and how they settled. But now that's of course expanded, and there's all sorts of other bodies there. So we've gone with the Americans, said people of color. So I don't know. We'll find some language to say that. Well, we're not just people of color. So this is a project that speaks a little bit about that whiteness in the white context before. So I'll give you a little bit of a context so that you can see what is happening in Australia. The Challenging Racism Report 2007 shows that more than 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people who speak a language other than English have experienced racism in an educational setting. Similar percentages were recorded for everyday racism in public spaces, shops, restaurants. Another survey says that 34% of people from non-English speaking backgrounds experienced discrimination. 39% of people born in India, 39% of people born in China, 55% of people born in South Korea, 67% of people born in Kenya, 75% of those born in Zimbabwe, and 77% of those born in Sudan. These reports not only show the pervasiveness of racism and discrimination within Australia against these bodies, but also that it's largely experienced by non-white migrants and African Australians in particular. So within Australia, people of African heritage continue to be constructed as dysfunctional, dirty, perpetual refugees, and culturally incompatible, legitimizing their misrecognition through practices of everyday racism. These damaging discourses have been perpetrated by powerful mainstream media institutions as well as in political rhetoric. While there are these toxic discourses, there are also spaces for resistance and resilience. So the second research project was developed following a similar model to the partnership with the agency that used the arts in Perth. I've worked with this particular group for a shorter period of time, maybe 6 years or so, and they've developed a whole series of projects. So this particular project that I'm going to talk about is called AMCA. So AMCA was a multidisciplinary performance that explored a third culture story and the narratives from the African diaspora looking at the journey of being, becoming, and existing. Amka means wake up, get up in Swahili. The use of the term Amka is, in most contexts in Swahili culture, has emphasis on urgency and frankness when articulated. The production explored identity, dispossession, and cultural conflict within the African diaspora experience, and was performed publicly over 2 nights at the Arts Centre in Melbourne. So then there's a story to that as well. A renowned and prestigious institution in the Central Business District. The performance combined poetry, music, dance, theatre, and projection through a series of individual ensemble pieces that interpret the African diaspora in Melbourne, as one performer reflected. For me, it was a platform for myself and others to represent ourselves, the ways we needed and wanted it to be in our way, being able to recenter the African narrative in a way that created a journey of reflection, critical conversations. We weren't continuing the same narrative of the African diaspora that is seen here in Australia, which is underrepresented in many platforms, spoken about out of context and usually given a single narrative, usually a negative narrative. The quotation captures very strong drivers for the work that the collective is producing, including their agency to navigate symbolic violence and to mobilize arts to produce alternative narratives and to assert their rights to self-expression. Through artistic expression, they conveyed complex personhoods. They often erased the dominant racialized representations of African communities. Wani expressed this negotiation in his astute awareness of the various borders that shape his own sense of self and belonging. I identified as an African, and I can identify as an African. I have absolutely no problem with it, but I think that most of the time when people identify you with it, they do place a limit and they do have narrow scope with which they look at it from, because I identify as an African. I know it's completely different to when my dad says he identifies as African, and then I identify very strongly as black globally because I'm placed as black. But then in Australia it's quite tricky because I'm in the type of black that's got to recognize that I'm on stolen land and that I'm here potentially as a colonizer if I'm not fully aware of my footprint and what I'm doing. So that's quite different to being black elsewhere. So he speaks about some of the sort of complexities around what it means to be a black person. Amka and the other projects laid foundations for the group, who is now also working on another program with the aim of to be self-sustaining arts collective. As part of this project, we're documenting the process of creating settings and transforming the relationship with an institution that supports them. The work includes the ways of examining the ways in which community and organizational processes and practices can undermine their desire to self-determine. The preliminary findings, guided by our analysis of this idea of edge effects or border, understanding what happens at borders, show how racialized communities are also constructed as at risk. The idea of race and risk become coupled together in discourses and institutional practices. And while on one hand this is meant to prevent harm, on the other the discourse and practice reinforces structural inequity and thwarts opportunities for agency. And this often happens with indigenous people, with black people, migrants, refugees, and all other vulnerable categories. Okay, so just to conclude. So to come back to the focus of how we create and mobilize community psychologists in and outside the university to contribute to empowerment and self-determination and the various communities who suffer the brunt of structural violence. For me, it is through these various strands of work at the borders and in between them that we're asking questions about how we can produce community psychologies in support of liberation goals of the communities in the local and global contexts, who bear the brunt of colonization, racism, sexism, and other forms of violence. This important task is also about shifting the gaze from the narrow epistemologies that promote ignorance, the discourses of the dominant, and dismantling privileged ideologies in everyday institutions that create harm. For me, for us, this orientation is the result of border crossing and boundary span. It is a speaking and listening position, our locus of enunciation. Liberation-oriented decolonial practice means, means to be open to the voices of different groups, to value their lived experiences and ways in which they know and act in the world, to understand our own locus of enunciation in the context of global history, and it's a very long global history, promote dialogical and relational ethics and epistemologies, and to be tolerant of ambiguity, to recognize our different locations, historical inheritance, and its implications for co-intentional action for racial justice, and importantly, given where I am, to use our privilege as academic scholars to create spaces within and outside the university where people can feel safe, be nurtured, and their cultural identity strengthened rather than eroded and diminished. The decolonial standpoint weaves a liberatory process for people who engage at the cultural interface via raised consciousness of our global history, committed to dialogical ethics and accountability, and encourages empathy and appreciation of indigenous sovereignty and ways of knowing, doing, and being.
So much. Thank you so much to our guests. Thank you for those incredibly rich and very thoughtful presentations. For me, when I hear the scholar activists and engage with scholar activists, I find it inevitably quite moving in all kinds of ways in a number of levels, and I'm sure it's been like that for many people in the audience. So thank you. It was also really interesting to hear about your work in India and Australia, and I think there are strong resonances, but there are also dissimilarities. And I think your offerings are an invitation to stretch our thinking, practice our imaginations in terms of how we do the work, how we theorize about it, how we, how we do it, how we think about it, how we go about the business of rupture and reconstitution. So thank you so much. I don't want to say much more because we have two discussants who are going to pick up on some of what you said and some of what you didn't say. But before we hand over to Professor Ratele and Nicholas Malherba, what we'd like to ask is, could you spend 2 minutes talking to the person next to you as a way of sharing your impressions about the offerings, questions you might have, observations you would like to share. Can you take 2 minutes to do that? Thank you. She's here.
Shall we start? Okay. All right, hello. Yeah. My name is Nick Malherbe. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Social Health Sciences, Violence and Injury Peace Research in South Africa, South African Medical Research Council, UNISA. Okay, so we were going to do it like a discussion, but I think we're just going to go sort of 5-minute reflection. All my reflections sort of ended up being questions. So maybe sort of throw it out to the professors who spoke now so nicely, but also other people who's trying to work, if this is the sort of psychological branch of liberation, maybe people in the sociology or other areas can also contribute to speak about how they've dealt with these things. So I saw the title of this talk had sort of "and limits" in brackets, so I'll try do a kind of dialectical thing with that, look at the limits of the limits, but then also kind of how those limits open up new kind of progressive ways to do things. So the first one I was sort of thinking of is, I know Martin Barro sort of refused a community psychology program in El Salvador, and because of the sort of institutional restraints that were placed on his work, I was wondering how you kind of bring liberation psychology into community psychology, sort of this borderless discipline into this kind of, is it sort of shoehorned in, does it fit in nicely in all of the problems people have experienced there? Another one is, I was talking about this briefly with Chris earlier, in that liberation psychology, from my knowledge, is not really like in vogue anymore. People sort of talking about critical psychology and decolonizing psychology. Does this reflect, do you think, irrelevance of liberation psychology or to the sort of present-day emancipatory requirements, or is sort of these new kind of branches, or maybe all branches in some ways, saying something, just saying the same thing but under a different name, or is there something in going back to the kind of language of liberation psychology? Then, okay, maybe two more little things here. There's sort of very specific struggles got spoken about. You don't have to speak to all these things, just what comes up. Are there kind of points of connection to be made between the struggles? And have you done that? How has that work done? It's quite difficult. Yeah, I just wanted to know of your experience with that. And then lastly, if this, to my understanding, liberation psychology, this is to do with maybe the form of it. If liberation psychology is kind of like a borderless thing, it's just not done in a very particular way, it draws on so many other influences. Is the form of this, does it carry influence for the kind of sort of people for whom borders and borderlessness is so pertinent? So kind of migration populations, migrant populations, Kurdish people, people living under Israeli occupation. There's so many. I was wondering if liberation psychology speaks to that in any particular way. Yeah, that's kind of my reflections.
I'm Copano Ratel, and I'm plugging. I've just done a book last month. 250. Yeah. Let me start here then, to Umitapa and Christopher, and all of you. Do you really think we can decolonize psychology? I mean, really? Do you think it's a possibility that before we die, we will be able to have decolonized psychology? Noble and fantastic project as it is. And of course, we can extend it. I see people have been attending some of the talks around the country around decolonizing universities. That we're really going to do the sorts of things that are required to do to change. So this is a question to you, because you end up by somehow saying what a liberating / decolonizing decolonial psychology might look like, might be, might do. And the second part of this question that I would like, to pose to you is this: yesterday and today I didn't sleep well. It seems coming every year around October. So I went to Ringwood Drive. In a house there, I met a woman called Eleanor. She gave me her name in a car. She says, short conversation. I told her, look, I haven't been sleeping. So I needed this tablet so I can come here and just be coherent. I don't know whether I am. And I'm going to be doing a lot of travel between now and next July. Starting next week, I'm in Nairobi, then I go to Oxford, and then I go back to Nairobi, then I go to Iceland, then I go to, all of that every second week or so. I don't know why I do this, because it's bad for environment, right? She says to me, before I leave, she says, I'm from Zimbabwe, and I have been feeling so unsafe in Cape Town. I live in Observatory. Please, here's my number. If you find anybody in London who can give me a job, any kind of job. So she's very nice uniform, doctor's administrator uniform, and she starts telling me a story. Now, Umitapa said over 1.9 million immigrants, people who have been disenfranchised. Do you think psychology? I mean, I when people come to me with stories like that, I don't know what to do with that. I think, okay, I just came in for the tablets. She says, please. She just saw that, oh, you're a professor, and you travel just, and of course she doesn't choose Nairobi or, Iceland or anything. She's talking about London. I want to leave South Africa. People are threatening me. I am so scared. If I can't do anything for one person, if I feel like I'm being imposed, if a clinician, well, first of all, clinical psychologists, can they do something for this one person? But for 1.9 million people who have been disenfranchised by Modi's government, do you think we can do something about that, psychologists? Which leads me to the second question. So in my travels now recently, a critical legal scholar who runs the CALS at WITS, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, Tsepo Madlingozi, one of the questions he asked me, he says, which we've asked with Nick and the younger researchers there about, this psychology business of yours, really, and Tsepo was highly, just horrifically smart young scholar who started, by the way, selling fruit on a train, became a PhD, is now running legal studies, critical legal studies. So it's awfully smart mind in the country. Says, look, you write books, it's really nice, but really this psychology of yours, do you need this psychology? Do we need psychology? That's the question, really, at the end. And of course it connects to what Chris was saying about learning from all over. Literally, some of these people you're quoting were disillusioned by psychology. They literally just forget about psychology. So Tsepo is asking me this question. So that's a question you will get. We must liberate psychology. We must be liberated from psychology. I genuinely think so. We've been doing some, and of course you mentioned accompaniment. And one of our younger researchers, we've been doing some amazing work. I think so. Entirely different, about writing different, producing knowledge that's refractive while we're talking to each other. One of the things, we have asked the same question. And she tells, can I tell this story? Can I tell it? But she tells about us in this group we have created, which is fantastic. But one of them, the person who has been holding us together is a man who looks like a guru called Muhammad Sidat, right? And then she. So we have organized a community engagement project, and one of us, the younger people, Sarah Day, who's here, tells about a woman she had met a couple of weeks back who had been abused by a boyfriend, who needed to go to get a protection order. And Sarah says, I have to accompany this woman, leave what we're doing here, a psychologist and whatever we are, and go to the police station. So she's doing accompaniment physically. And I love the story, the way she tells us. She told us in February 1st, and we're now written it down. But in that moment, I realized that even when you think you have created a wonderful space, supporting the community, there's this other work you've never been taught of literally getting up from your office as a clinical psychologist in a hospital and walking with people to police station because of this work. So that's another question about, is that psychology? Is that psychology? Well, this is the question to you. It's for counseling psychologists who are here and other kinds of psychologists, is that psychology? Do you teach this people in the classes? Okay, that's the next two other questions perhaps I want to. In walking around, I've traveled so many universities lately. Students grab me at the end. After we've spoken, they grab me at the end. They say, this African psychology of yours, okay, fine. But what about? They ask me two questions in addition to therapy, which a lot of questions. One is, you don't talk enough about healing. You can do all of this stuff, but racism, sexism, all kinds of coloniality has just messed us up. It's messed our families. And it took me so long to get around to this part about, we talk with Chris yesterday, about what psychologists' complicity with coloniality has done to people. District 6, just the land, just casting people off, right? And so they say, how about you do the psychology that both heals us and does the spirit, heals our spirits? I'm not that kind of psychology. I've written a little bit thing about it, but I'm not that kind of psychologist. Okay, so two questions to end here then. And I think it was Umi again, talking about the concrete economic, political, cultural, social struggles. You have to connect to those, and we don't do that. So psychology has a major limits, including liberating psychology. Maybe I need to be convinced, although it's debate as a psychologist. But three questions again. So do you think, how many of you here think, and me and Chris, think we will, in this society, in India, in Australia, adequately resolve the problem of immigration in the world? Really, even you can bring it down to psychologists, that we will adequately resolve the problem of Africans. I don't know how they do that. Traveling now from countries, and they're going to Mexico, they go up, they want to cross. How long these people travel? Of course, Mexican moving into, and then the Somalis in Sweden, the Zimbabweans in South Africa, the Bengali people who have been, of histories of Bengalis who want to be cast out of India. Are we going to be able to do this as the kinds of people that we're trained to be? I was asking Reed, how many of you, hands up, who thinks we're going to solve this problem before some of us die? You think, how much thinks we get? 2, it's optimistic. I must hear this. Second, how many of you think we will? This keeps me awake at night. How many of you really think we're going to solve the problem of violence in South Africa in a generation? Adequately. End it. End the problem of violence, of men's violence against children, women, other men, gender non-conforming people, and the earth. Not in our lifetime. Lastly, how many of you are happy with your lives? No, really, how many of you are happy with your lives? Well, I was hoping for more hands, because somehow we're born into a world that is unjust, and we realize it's injustice. But at a certain point, we become part of that justice. We become happy with our lives. Thank you.
provocation, but wonderful provocations. So please, while you gather yourselves and think about some of these questions, we are going to open up and give the audience an opportunity to engage with you and to engage with each other. So, Rashid, can we take 2 more questions?
It's 2:54 now, so I imagine by 4:54 we should be done. Do you want to go longer?
All right. Rashid, all right. Remind about time, but it looks to me like most people are here and present and wish to continue the engagement, and apparently we have this venue. Thank you, Mesh. So shall we continue? Okay.
Thank you for the questions, the provocations, a lot to think about. I think one of the things that I want to highlight, which I think touches upon quite a few questions, and I know that it certainly reflects, the questions that you raised in particular about psychology, its relevance, or is that what we should be doing? And my response is, I don't know, and at times I don't think so. When I think about psychology, liberation psychology, or many of our projects around decolonizing psychology, I think I view that as a strategy. It's a strategic way to engage with issues that we care about, given the spaces that we occupy, and really thinking about how we do occupy academic spaces, and in the university settings that we have, and having privileged access to knowledge production in many ways, even if when we are at the fringes, what can we do with that? To me, that is my entry into psychology. So there are times when I really don't think it is worth fighting the fight to say that this is what psychology ought to be. There are days when I really don't care what psychology is, as long as I'm able to do what I want to do and the kind of struggles that I hope to accompany. So that's one of my responses. So a lot of the and this is not to say that speaking back to establishment psychology or Eurocentric psychology is not important. I think all of us are very, very invested in that, and particularly given psychology's role, complicity, and very, very active role in perpetuating colonialism and coloniality, that is a critical task. But again, it has to come down to what are the struggles that we are a part of. And connected to this is also the issue around how we think about social change. There are ways in which, when we situate ourselves at the center of change and we want to see change happen in our lifetime, that's very egocentric, and that's kind of self-serving. So part of this is thinking about, how do we relate to wider struggles, and what does it mean to be parts of struggles where we know that we are not going to see any shift in our lifetime, but that doesn't take away from the commitment. And I think that comes from developing close relationships, and that comes from accompanying people and accompanying movements. So then this sense of what we can do is, it's always a collective, and it doesn't have to be as an individual, or it doesn't have to be in a limited role as a psychologist. So part of what I'm really thinking about, and what I'm pushing for, is to think of this, of what we do, in a way decenter psychology, decenter academics, even though it's ironical that I speak about this while I'm sitting in a university and doing this, but for me, that is, I think, where we need to be going. So in response to a lot of questions that have come up about psychology and about our relevance, it's, I think we use it where it's needed, but always sort of with that should always be in service of people's struggles.
Okay, thanks. I took notes here and I can't remember any of the questions that were asked now. But I think some of the questions makes me think about psychology, and when we talk about psychology, what people have in their minds when talk about that. Because I think there's psychologies. There's lots of different ways in which people are practicing, engaging with psychology. I don't think that psychology is going to be a panacea to any of the major problems that we have in the world. I think that the way in which, and I think about knowledge production. I think about ways in which we are privileged in university spaces, and the way in which we are also regulated. The profession is regulated. The profession is part of the neoliberal market economy, business, and it advances particular stakes, particular ways of thinking, particular ways of being. So part of the work that I'm interested in, and that I think that I can do and I'm not a psychologist. I'm not registered. I'm not licensed. I've studied psychology, and I've chosen not to be registered. And I work in university, thinking about researching and how to mobilize what it is that psychology has to offer in terms of understanding the sorts of ways in which oppressive systems get under people's skins. So part of how I am engaging with psychology is trying to produce something that isn't limited by how psychology has defined itself. So the challenges come at the borders of the disciplines and how disciplines have been constructed and continue to be constructed. And again, we've got markets that we're working to. We've got and people are being trained into particular sorts of in particular sorts of ways. So when I think about psychology, I am thinking about how best do I locate what it is that I do, whether it's community psychology, and sometimes think, well, it's not quite that. Is it cultural psychology? Well, maybe not that either. But I think it's always a process of constructing a way of engaging with knowledges, people's experiences, people's ways of being, and in what places do people feel good, do they feel support and so forth, and is it psychology that's going to do that, is it education that's going to do that, or is it a combination of disciplines that's going to work together to achieve particular sorts of things. Psychology does set itself up as having to answer a lot of, or solve a lot of the problems of the world. I'm not too sure that it can because of its focus, and it's partly contributed to a lot of the problems as well. So I think it's a really difficult question, and I think in universities it's a really difficult place to have, because disciplines are narrowing, and we are asking for them not to be that narrow. So it's always a struggle, and it's always a matter of how best do we expand some of the sorts of boundaries in order to realize some of the sorts of aspirations and values that we want to enact on the world. The idea of community psychology as existentialist, as something that is partly problematic, and what Martin Burrow said, he's not going to do that because it's a version of a helping profession, and it's not the version that he wanted to develop in his context. In Australian context, we've had so many changes. There's one community psychology program in the country, and I'm teaching in the only one that's left. But that's not to say that people aren't imparting community-oriented perspectives at different universities. The one that I am in has also been transformed because the practices of the profession has shifted and become narrower. It's very individual centered. So I, to some extent, feel like I've participated in the execution of community psychology in Australia, and I do feel that that what community psychology had to offer and its place in the university is precarious, and it always has been in the Australian context. And lots of people have raised questions about should this be a profession or should it be a discipline? Should we be training people in particular sorts of ways so that they can become registered psychologists to work as a psychologist in certain ways? Or is this an orientation, a way of thinking about engaging in psychology? And I think that's always the question that I have to come back to. And whether we call it community psychology or liberation-oriented psychology or whatever the name is going to be, I think the key thing is going to be the set of values, principles, and the sorts of concepts that drives it and the position that you write from. And when we try to articulate what does it mean to actually have or engage with a decolonizing standpoint, it's always an intentional action. It's not like, look, this is just what we have, and this is. It's not claiming that I am a good person and I'm doing this work. It is claiming a stance and talking about particular ways of enacting. It's always with an intention and intentional ways of engaging. So it's always productive and generative as well. But I think there's always particular sets of limits around it. And it is the borders that's set within the context of disciplines and the politics within the universities systems as well. So that was one question. I can't remember any of the other questions. So Kapano, you asked us about migration. That one's too big. I don't think psychologists are going to be able. Look, I think psychology are going to. In Australia, we've got lots of versions of migration. We've got some groups of people that are treated and imprisoned on islands, and we don't say it's detention camps really around the country. And then there's other migrants who we want to come because of the capital and economics and so forth. So we've got very horrible policies, structural policies that discriminates and enforces particular boundaries around who's valued, who's not valued. Psychologists have fought very hard to show the harms that's done because of those sorts of policies, medical professionals and so forth. And the politicians and governments and so forth, they don't remove those policies because there's broader systems that shapes to some extent, and mostly economic systems that's been continuing for years and years and years. So I think this is all about allegiances and collaborations and grassroots movements and so forth that people have to be part of, and psychology have to be part of partnerships and so forth and so on. But I don't know if who has made movement and the mobility of people a problem? At what point did people start saying that, well, the movement of people is problematic? But when it is about the forceful displacement and so forth, then you can see that there's particular vested interest and so forth. That forces some people to move, and they're not welcome to come to other places, especially if the movement is up north. Okay.
I just wanted to add on to Chris's comments in response to the question of migration, particularly in doing the work and in working alongside grassroots organizers in Assam. Something that has become really evident to me is, and actually across the globe, if you look at it, that it is always, when we talk about migration, or sort of any dominant discourse about migration, whether it's in public policy or in scholarly works, it always it takes the nation state as the vantage point, and particularly the modern nation state. So even when we have psychologists who are documenting the various negative effects of the kinds of oppressive and conservative policies that are in place with respect to migration, there is still there is not a questioning of the categories that we have in the first place, of who is the migrant and what are the host communities. So you have these categories are so reified now that we don't even question them anymore. And part of what I think that we need to be asking more is flipping the question. Why do we think about migration always from the from the perspective of the nation state, from the perspective of the colonizer or the settler colonizer? Why not think about migration from the perspective of those who have been colonized, refugee populations, people who are being rendered stateless? So what does that mean? And when we flip that question, then we begin to see that that movement and migrations are complicated, but in many ways they're also the norm rather than the exception. and particularly when you look at the numbers of people who are currently displaced in the world. So part of what I think that we need to be questioning is even those categories that we take for granted. So we should not be arguing for more progressive border policies, or relax the borders, or create more programs and services for migrants because that's what they need. But even outside of that, why does the figure of the migrant have to be this abject person? So that then it just becomes simply about suffering, and now who is sort of at the mercy of of this nation state that the person has moved to. So how do we begin to challenge some of those questions? Even in in fact, it kind of goes to the idea of denaturalizing the way we think about migration now.
Hi, thank you for hearing my question. Professor Sun, you spoke about commitment to practice and how do we construct a psychology instead of borrowing one. I'm a student, and how do I as a student and how do we as students at a university that 99% of my textbooks have been Eurocentric and westernized psychology textbooks, and liberation psychology, African psychology has been mentioned once or twice in a PDF as a side note. How can we as students on this level, how can we introduce concepts of African psychology and liberation psychology to students who have never heard of one, so that we can construct psychology instead of continuing to borrow one on a student level?
Does anyone want to answer that? No. Kapana? Look, I can say how we what we've tried to do in Australia. So I've been working with a group in New Zealand. They were at Waikato and Massey, and we got together in around, I don't know, mid 2000s, and we were concerned about the absences of Maori perspectives, indigenous perspectives, and different psychologies. And so we decided that we were going to write a textbook on, and it's called this. I'm not plugging the book like Kapano did before, but I have to but I have to tell you that is the project. But the project was us taking some of the responsibility for saying that we need to repluralize the discipline, because I mean it has become hegemonic in the sense of what psychology is, and there's again, I mean, there's markets and so forth that actually shapes a lot of this. So the work that we've done has been about how do we actually write, and again it is from our locations into dialogue with the psychology that we have been trained into. So it's not, I mean, it wasn't a matter of saying that, well, look, we're going to disregard all of what has been taught somewhere else, but it is about how do we actually have a conversation to ask questions about this. Because often, I mean, psychology says that, look, we've got foundational theories and so forth. But a lot of people say that, well, we have to re-examine those sorts of things because the social isn't static, history isn't static, cultures aren't static. So we have to revisit those sorts of things and ask questions about what do they mean now. So, I mean, so the role of the student is you have to agitate in your universities also to say that, look, we need to see ourselves in these, in our curriculum. And if the professors don't want to do that, then you've got to ask questions about why don't they do that? Because if we don't take the responsibility, and I think this whole movement around people talking about we have to insert the global south, their experiences, their knowledges, in curriculum, we have to do that. No one else is going to do that because this is our vantage point. And we have to actually engage that vantage point as a point of dialogue with what is it that we've actually inherited, and what is it that people are producing. And the more things diversify, the global networks and so forth. And I mean, look, I've been privileged in being able to see and to connect with different people around the world, and to see how people are actually trying to understand and generate new psychologies. And so textbooks are to some extent part of the problem of implementing particular sorts of hegemonies, and ways of being. So So we have to think innovatively. You should encourage your teachers to say, please don't teach from the textbook. let's do other things. But I think there is a dialogue to be had, and we've tried to do that because we wanted to include the perspectives of migrant communities. We wanted to include the knowledges that indigenous people are producing, and we wanted people who are coming through the education system not to just imagine that they're actually speaking and engaging with North American examples. We need to understand what life means in our sorts of context too. And sometimes it's very similar, and other times it's not. But a lot of the time people, I mean, they welcome those possibilities to imagine that there can be a plural psychology.
Chris and Urmi, thank you very much for your contributions, the questions, as well as to Nick and Kupano. And just as a way of rounding off, I want to just please join me in thanking our presenters and our discussants, please. And any final words on your guys' side before we go into some ceremonial things?
No, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to my family members. It's really, you've created, the anxiety level has just gone up with your presence, but no, thank you again for hosting us here. I've really enjoyed it, and I really look forward to talking more over the next week with you guys.
Yeah, I echo Chris's thanks, and it's such an honor and a privilege to be here, and Shehnaz and Umesh and everyone else who's been involved in putting this together. It means a lot to me, and to be in this space with you all, it feels like we are part of something together. Not quite sure what this together is and what it means, and I think that's going to be unfolding over, I don't know, however many years, but right now I feel grounded and I feel a sense of belonging, and that's really amazing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Masana again and invite her to come and do a piece, and then we'll do a few ceremonials. Thanks.
At my second therapy session of the week, my mother is explaining my depression to my therapist. She speaks of suicide as if it is a joke, as if depression isn't the one laughing, as if she knows what it feels like to wake up and believe that death the only option is. She speaks of suicide like an incompetent human being who has never felt pain so severe that you would do anything, and I mean anything, just not to feel anything. She speaks of depression, and I envy her because I don't speak of it, I speak to it every single day, and sometimes I ask it not to take me away from her. See, I don't fear dying, and maybe that's the problem. Maybe that is the problem. But, Google defines depression as extreme feeling of sadness, feeling sad. Depression isn't a feeling. See, a feeling is a reaction. A reaction is ever-changing. No one feels depressed. You don't feel depression. Depression fills you. You embody it. Maybe that's why one of the symptoms is sleeping, because that's the closest you get to dying. That's the closest you're going to get to forgetting. Forgetting, as if that's any better. My mother suffers from dementia. And memory loss doesn't seem like something so bad until the woman who gave birth to you asks you who you are. until you realize that loving someone is rooted in the memory and she doesn't remember loving you. See, sometimes she forgets that he ever left. Sometimes she forgets how she got those bruises on her arms. Sometimes I wish I could forget. Sometimes I wish I couldn't feel him. Maybe if I could forget, I wouldn't flinch every time someone raises their hand to hug me, to high-five me, to show me affection. See, he has given me PTSD, and I haven't been to war, but I've been fighting battles with mental illness since the age of 4, and they tell me, breathe, just breathe, 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 it is not here, breathe. I mean, what can you honestly stress about? Breathe, 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 it is not anxiety, breathe, breathe, just control your breath, control yourself, breathe, it is not depression. You are just sad. Breathe. Control it, they say. I mean, if you are smiling, you cannot be depressed, right? So breathe, breathe, control it, smile. See, my mother speaks of depression and I envy her because I don't speak of it, I speak to it every single day. Sometimes I ask it not to take me away from her. Wonder when I'll lose.